Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session on research and new developments, what's on the horizon. My name's Marcia Hooper and I'll be your session chair. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Dan Chambers. If I listed all his achievements, I'm afraid he wouldn't have time to speak. Briefly, Dan is a thoracic transplant physician, an interstitial lung clinician, disease expert, a translational clinician researcher, say that 3 times. He is an internationally recognised authority in the fields of lung fibrosis, cell therapy for lung disease and lung transplantation. Dan is a professor of medicine at the Queensland University and heads one of the world's largest clinical trials programs in lung fibrosis. Excuse me. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dan Chambers.
Thank you so much for a very kind introduction, Marcia. It's actually really such a pleasure to be here. One of my favourite things to do is actually to speak to my patients in particular about their concerns and their worries, and to provide the best information that I can to dispel rumours and get rid of myths and make things as plain as possible. So it is really such a pleasure to be here. So I've been asked to talk about what's on the horizon, which is a huge topic. So I'm going to just give some broad brushstrokes of what I see as the future of pulmonary fibrosis care. And I guess the summary is that, thank goodness it's an enormous topic now, because I remember back, probably about 1999 when I started working in pulmonary fibrosis, it was a very small topic. All research was dedicated towards asthma and COPD, and there was no research at all going on with respect to pulmonary fibrosis. So I'm very thankful that I've got a huge amount to talk about, but I'm just going to give you those broad brushstrokes. I don't need to tell you a lot of this information, but I guess the main message from this slide is that although this occasion is affiliated with the Rare Lung Disease Conference that's happening at the moment in Sydney, I don't see this as a rare disease, all right? So people who are affected by this disease, you're not alone. I have hundreds of people who I look after who have this disease. I think it's just under-recognised a lot of the time. It's certainly not very common, but it's just underappreciated as cause of breathlessness. The number of times I've seen someone who has seen 2 or 3 cardiologists, had all the tests and the heart tests, your heart's fine, and then nobody's actually just listened to their chest. And the diagnosis is a year or 18 months ago it should have been made. So it's very frustrating from where I sit. And we know that the prevalence is much higher than people think. So that, I don't know if I go back here, but that study at the bottom there is from the United States in veterans, and the prevalence in that population was sort of 10 times what the previous estimates were. So it's just under-recognised. I'm just going to give you a little bit of science, not too much, but I think it's really important just to contextualise the advances that are happening. And I think you can consider, certainly in my mind, pulmonary fibrosis, and I'm not just talking about IPF, this is really, these mechanisms are the same across all the different fibrotic diseases. Starts with a change often in the genes, plus an environmental insult, sometimes more the environmental insult. So, whether that be dust exposure or smoke exposure or asbestos exposure, and then a genetic component, which means that person is more susceptible to that dust. But a lot of these diseases are all about accelerated ageing of the lung. And I liked the expression in Lisa's talk about your brain's often younger than your lungs. And I see that the way we're going to really address this disease is by making your lungs younger. And I think that's actually achievable, which I'll come to. There's an intermediate step before fibrosis occurs, which is largely involves these cells called macrophages in the lung. And we know a lot more about those cells than we did even, say, 5 years ago. And now there are some really bad cells that come in there that mediate a lot of the scarring. And there are now attempts in my lab and also all over the world to develop treatments to target those cells in the middle there. And then down the bottom of the pathway is where the fibrosis happens. And at the moment, that is where almost all of the effort in the development of new drugs is focused. And of course, that's how pirfenidone and nintedanib both work, is by their anti-scarring medications. But that's just one component that needs to be treated, very important one, but it's just one, and we haven't attacked the top 2 at all yet. So one of the key observations that's been made, can I just ask, who here has heard of telomeres? Yep. So I reckon that the number of people here who've heard of telomeres is, the proportion is probably higher than many of the clinicians I speak to. It won't come as a surprise to many people here that this disease does run in families sometimes. Not everybody's affected, and people are affected in different ways, but all of my patients recognise that, yes, I had an uncle who had this, and it's not a surprise to people. Whereas a lot of clinicians still don't understand a lot of this is fundamentally a genetic disease associated with environmental exposure. And one of the key problems is accelerated ageing of the lung. So your telomeres, just briefly for the few people actually, which is nice to see, who didn't know what a telomere is. So telomeres are little caps on the end of your chromosomes that keep them healthy all through your life. So they're a bit like the plastic cap on the end of a shoelace, just to keep your chromosomes healthy all through your life. And they're very important so cells can continue to proliferate all through your lifespan. And when they get too short, the cell can't then repair itself and replicate, and it dies effectively. And that triggers a lot of things, but including fibrosis. So fundamentally, this disease is a lot about accelerated ageing of the lung. Just to highlight, so fortunately, as I said, this huge field in terms of the breakthroughs in the clinical trials. Hopefully many or most of you are aware of the PACT group. So this is a clinical trial network that I was fortunate enough to be the initial chair of up until 2 years ago, and now Ian Glaspole is the chair. So it's seven years, I think. Alison, maybe 8, something like that. And Alison's been the driving force behind that group. But the whole point of PACT is to make sure that people who have a diagnosis of pulmonary fibrosis have access to the latest treatments and the latest clinical trials. Because we know that although I know there are all of these potentially amazing therapies available in clinical trials, a lot of people aren't even aware that there's a possibility that you could participate in a clinical trial. So it's all about connecting consumers with the opportunity to take part in a clinical trial. So if you go on the PACT website, you will see almost all of the currently recruiting studies in Australia and be able to see that we've got a coordinator and be able to see where you can go to find out if there might be a clinical trial that's suitable for you. So just coming back to my point before about understanding the steps that cause fibrosis, from the genes and the environment to that intermediate cell to the fibrosis, this is really important because it's been shown time and time again that if you understand the fundamental causes of the disease, you're going to be much more likely to find a cure. And it makes sense. If you don't know what's wrong with a car as a mechanic, you're not going to get anywhere. And I really hope, I have no idea about machinery, so I'm really hoping that my mechanic can work out what's wrong with the car, because unless you can do that, it's never going to be repaired. And it's the same in medicine, really. So the fact that we now understand about the genetics means that we're much more likely to be able to develop really, really effective treatments. And that's been shown time and time again. So in lung disease, probably the best example is in cystic fibrosis, which is a genetic disorder. I'm a transplant physician. It used to be that the most common reason to need a transplant was having cystic fibrosis. It's now quite rare because there are new drugs that were developed about 10 years ago now, which target the genetic defect, and those people are now very well. Incredible transformation in their life. And the same is going to be possible for pulmonary fibrosis. And so this is what this slide is about. So all of the bubbles down in the bottom left there are most of the pharmaceutical activity. So they're all antifibrotics of one flavour or another, and they're going to be really important. And I'm sure there'll be some of those ones that come through, and we have positive trials and new treatments available, hopefully with fewer side effects than the currently available antifibrotics, pirfenidone and nintedanib. And that'll be great, but that's just going to be part of the story. There's going to need to be other treatments that target those upstream pathways and eventually the really fundamental genomic causes. So this is an example of one thing that we've done in my lab, is to target those macrophage cells that I talked about before, so the intermediary between the gene and the fibrosis. So this is actually a really great collaboration with Rowan Davis there from Nature Bank, which is an amazing facility in Brisbane. Rowan has often himself, but other people have gone around and collected samples from all over Queensland, rainforest, reef, etc., novel compounds. And so we worked with Rowan to identify new compounds that have activity to switch those bad cells back to good again. So that's been a really satisfying collaboration. And so we're moving one of those compounds through into development now. But this is where I think some of the big breakthroughs are going to happen. So I think it is going to be possible in the not too distant future to reverse that accelerated lung ageing. And I'm working with a company, a US company called Rejuvenation Technologies, which is an mRNA therapeutic company. So I'll tell you a little bit about what that technology is, but essentially it's a way of delivering the enzyme that lengthens your telomeres into the lung stem cells via the bloodstream. So that one dose, and so we've developed this over, well, when I say me for the last 3 or 4 years, my great friends John and Glenn, who are out of Stanford University over the last 15 years, have developed this treatment, and we know it works in real human cells. It lengthens the telomeres, reverses about 7 years of ageing with one dose, and we'll be going into clinical trials with this end of next year. So watch this space. In the meantime, John McIntosh and I in Brisbane are working on a small molecule treatment to lengthen telomeres. This trial is still recruiting, so if anybody is interested, please contact myself or via Alison, or it's on the PACT website. So that's the Telescope study, and that involves taking a synthetic androgen called danazol or placebo to see whether that can lengthen telomeres in blood, with the idea that the same thing will happen in the lung. So just very quickly, so mRNA therapeutics, I don't know how much, I've got a few minutes. So these are the same as the COVID vaccine technology, all right? So what it involves is delivering mRNA, which is the code that makes proteins in your blood, in your body, into cells. What that means is that you can deliver any protein that you want into any cell in the body. And so the COVID vaccines, what they did was deliver the mRNA that encoded the spike protein on the outside of the coronavirus into your body. You would then make a protein, the spike protein, and you would then develop an immune response to that. And so that's how these therapies work. And they really mean that you can design a treatment however you want. So you can deliver any protein to pretty much any cell in the body directly. So it's a massive revolution in medicines and across the board. But in terms of pulmonary fibrosis, I think this is going to be really exciting. So the way this works is that intravenous delivery of the lipid nanoparticles, which are the little fat droplets that hide the mRNA from your body until they get into the cell. These have been designed to go to your lung. And so they go to the lung and then deliver their payload, which is the TERT mRNA, so it's part of the telomerase complex, into the lung stem cells. And then that is translated into protein, which then attaches itself to the telomere and lengthens the telomere. So one dose adds about 500 bases to the telomere, which is about 7 years worth of ageing. And before anybody asks, yes, it does work on skin and hair and everything else as well. So it is actually an incredible anti-aging treatment. So I'll probably leave it there, so we've got time for questions. But there's just fortunately there are too many amazing new antifibrotics and other treatments that are coming through, in various phases. So phase 1 which is first in human, up to phase 3, which is the last big trial that's done before a medication becomes available. And I have no doubt that some of these will be positive, probably some of them as early as the next year or two. We will know that some of those trials are positive, and there'll be new antifibrotics with less side effects, perhaps are more effective than the currently available ones. And then those other therapies that will be added on to really get to the heart of the disease. And alongside that will be improved ways of making a diagnosis, so that we do not have that issue where people are waiting a year or 18 months to get a diagnosis. When they're given a diagnosis, or maybe it's IPF, maybe it's hypersensitivity pneumonitis, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, all of that complexity will be gone because we'll be able to understand exactly what the cause is in any single person, which is the key to delivering effective treatments. So I think that's all I had. Just another shout out for PACT there, but I'm very happy if there are any questions to take any. And really, it's such a pleasure. So thank you very much to the Lung Foundation for supporting this event, and I really truly mean it. I love doing these kind of talks. So.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have a question up the back.
Hello. I'm just wondering whether you're aware of any research into pulmonary fibrosis for people with scleroderma or systemic sclerosis.
Yeah. So absolutely. So there are quite a few trials that are looking into new antifibrotics for people who have scleroderma, interstitial lung disease. So one of them is sponsored by Boehringer. So there are quite a few opportunities there. And previously, people with scleroderma-related interstitial lung disease were sort of put into a separate pot from people who had IPF. We now know that a lot of the mechanisms are really very similar in the lung and that the drugs work in a very similar way. I like to think of it, a lot of people are sort of categorised as what disease they've got based on what their CT scan looks like, whereas the cells that make the scarring in the lung, they're pretty dumb. They just do one thing, they just make the scar. They certainly can't read CT scans to understand how to behave. And so therefore they do respond to the same anti-scarring drugs as you would expect if you just think about it for a second. Yeah. So there are quite a few. They're on the PACT website if you have a look. Yep. If you can't find them there, let me know and I can put you in touch with whoever is your local trials unit. And yeah.
What you were speaking about with targeting the proteins, etc., does that come under the cover of monoclonal antibodies? Am I on the right area?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. But what it is so I think of it as like there have been so far two revolutions in medicine. First one was when we developed small molecule drugs like Panadol, and most antibiotics. The next one was those monoclonal antibodies, which were developed around the 1980s when they started to come through. These mRNA therapeutics are the next generation where you can deliver. So the monoclonals, they block things and they only work if you're lucky enough to have a particular pathway that you can block, whereas the mRNA therapeutics, you can do it to anything. So it means that lots of things that previously there was no way of making a drug are now treatable.
Terrific. Thanks very much.
Hi, I was just going to ask you about the lung transplants. Do you do many of pulmonary fibrosis?
Yeah,
and
so
the success rate and how old? Is there a cut-off? All that sort of thing.
Yeah. So in terms of lung transplantation, so pulmonary fibrosis is now by far the most common reason that someone might need a lung transplant. So it was actually in 2007 when lung fibrosis became the most common indication, we call it, the reason for needing a lung transplant. Prior to that, it was cystic fibrosis, but they crossed over in 2007, and now it's by far the highest, the leading cause of lung transplantation. In terms of your questions about age, I think, what's the upper age limit? It's a very, very common question. The truth, I'm in the Queensland lung transplant program, and there are international guidelines about age, but the real answer is that there is no upper age limit. And biologic age is much more important than just subtracting the date of birth from the current date, which is not a great way of calculating someone's age. It's all about their biologic age. So someone who, according to the numbers, is 70, but actually biologically is 55, that's fine. Alternatively, if someone's biologically 70 when they're chronologically 50, it may well not work out. So it's a very complicated procedure. There's lots of factors that need to be taken into account, including age, but biologic age is actually what we're really, really interested in. So what it's all about is obviously when we do a transplant procedure, we're replacing the lungs, but we're not replacing anything else. And so everything else we need to know is going to have to be good enough to be able to tolerate what is a massive procedure. In terms of outcomes, unfortunately, they've not improved much over the last 30 years. They're pretty much the same, and the main enemy there is actually a form of fibrosis of the lung, which is a lot similar actually to the lung fibrosis that we're all sitting here talking about. But 5-year survival is about 70%, so the chance of surviving 5 years is about 70% in most programs, and 10 years about 35%. But a lot of it comes down to just being very careful with advice after transplant. So, those averages hide a lot of variation. Some people, unfortunately, have a very bad course early on. Our oldest person in Queensland is now 30 years since he had his transplant. He's very well.
Oh, look, I've just got a quick question about the fibrotic medication. So with these new mRNA therapeutics, do you see them being used in conjunction with the antifibrotics, or are they going to overtake the antifibrotics? And I'm early diagnosed IPF. I'm not taking any medication at present. What is best practice? Should I be on medication early? Is there a increased efficacy if I have medication or start medication early?
Yeah, so two great questions. So I would definitely say there's always going to be a place for the antifibrotics because they do deal with that pathway right at the end to stop the scarring getting worse, but you've still got to attack the fundamental cause. So it's going to be a combination, I would definitely say. Don't know which combination, but that's what the future will hold. My personal practice in someone who has IPF is, in most cases, to start treatment as early as possible because once you lose lung function, you can't regain it. That said, there are a lot of factors that are particular to any particular individual, but I think that's a good principle. The other thing is that a lot of people are worried about the side effects of the drugs, but you may not get any. And if you do get some, you stop the drug and then they go away. So there's really not too much harm in trying the antifibrotics, and many people actually don't have many side effects at all. Of course, some do, and I'm sure there are plenty of people here going, wow.
Well, thank you so much. That was wonderfully informative, wasn't it? So can we please give a round of applause for Professor Chambers?